U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent issued a stark warning just days ago, declaring that Iran's oil pumping capacity will soon collapse, and predicting a gasoline shortage may genuinely be looming in Iran in the very near future. This dire assessment frames a rapidly unfolding crisis where Tehran, which once believed missiles and drones would guarantee victory against the United States, is now effectively raising the white flag of defeat on an entirely different front: its energy economy. A relentless naval blockade enforced by the United States in the Strait of Hormuz is systematically severing every artery of Iran's financial lifeline. This comes after former President Donald Trump swiftly dismissed Tehran's compromise offer to reopen Hormuz and defer the nuclear issue. Then, a bombshell announcement caught Iran completely off guard, sending shockwaves across the global arena. The United Arab Emirates unveiled a surprising new route capable of bypassing Iran's biggest leverage card, the Strait of Hormuz. These combined moves are now turning Tehran's energy market into a scene of catastrophic collapse, all within a matter of days. The country's oil economy is quite literally gasping for breath right now. The countdown has effectively begun for the Tehran regime. Iran has only 12 to 22 days of unused storage capacity left. The moment that window closes, Tehran will be forced to cut another 1.5 million barrels from its daily oil production. At Chabahar, the only serious export terminal outside Hormuz, where on a normal day only 5 ships would be moored, today more than 20 tankers and cargo vessels sit jammed and waiting. The U.S. naval blockade has slashed Iran's energy exports by 70%. Tehran is losing $13 billion every month. Astonishing, but true. Every month, a staggering sum is evaporating from the country's financial ledger, and the situation has grown so dire that as a last resort, the Iranian regime has begun using scrapped, half-rotted ships as storage. This financial hemorrhage is unprecedented in modern economic warfare against Iran. Previous sanctions aimed to restrict revenue, but this direct physical blockade is creating an immediate, unsustainable cash drain, forcing desperate measures like using derelict vessels for storage, a clear sign of systemic failure. But behind the curtain, there is a far bigger and far more dangerous picture for Iran. The storm brewing within the regime itself is even heavier than the crisis visible from the outside. Iran's Supreme National Security Council has issued highly critical signals that with the deteriorating economy, anti-regime protests could erupt once again. What's more, the council cited a surprising figure for how long Iran can withstand this naval blockade. Tehran may have very little time left, but that is not the only source of danger. The country's labor force is also caught in a massive problem. By the end of spring, millions of people in Iran's private sector could lose their jobs. In other words, a second crisis is at the door for the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and the regime, both of which intend to continue the standoff with the United States. Iran is being dragged toward a position of leaving every energy card it holds on the table and quietly accepting defeat. Tehran's last energy weapon no longer works. So how did all of this stack up on top of each other? The origins, effects, and consequences of this striking collapse will genuinely surprise you, because the very first mistake that drove the regime into this dead end was choosing to threaten the Gulf states and spread the fear of prolonged war throughout the region instead of thinking about its energy revenues. Yes, you read that correctly. The regime in effect hung itself with its own rope. This flawed decision pushed Iran into perhaps its most critical bend. The roots of the country's energy and storage crisis took shape precisely at this point. The reality behind this crisis emerges clearly in the report by maritime intelligence firm Kepler. In March 2026, Iran's daily oil exports stood at 1.85 million barrels. 2 weeks after the blockade began, that number crashed to 567,000 barrels. If the current pace continues, Iran's storage facilities will be packed full in short order. And the moment they fill up, production has to stop. But the real danger is not the short-term loss. It is permanent industrial collapse. Because a significant portion of the wells that get shut in can never return to their former capacity. In petroleum engineering literature, this is called irreversible production loss. Analysts estimate the permanent loss at between 300,000 and 500,000 barrels per day. Even if the blockade is lifted, Iran's oil industry may never return to its former state. Tehran is suffering not merely a temporary shock, but a permanent loss of industrial capacity. This means that a single conflict is wiping out the country's vision for the future of its energy sector. In other words, the regime is leaving behind on the table not just today's revenue, but tomorrow's capacity as well. With the closure of the exit gates at the port of Chabahar as well, the losses will likely be impossible to recover. This port had for years been Tehran's strategic trump card. the plan B it boasted of in case Hormuz were ever closed. The port had been developed by India. It was also the exit gateway for the China and Russia-backed INST corridor. Tehran viewed this port as one of the most strategic energy reserves in its hands. Now the wall of the U.S. Navy is rising in front of Tehran's Plan B as well. The tankers stranded at the port can no longer leave because the U.S. Navy is also halting every Iran-linked vessel in the Gulf of Oman. The Tehran regime is watching in real time as the alternative route it has touted for years is reduced to a graveyard of imprisoned tankers, and Iran has nothing resembling a Plan C. What's even more striking is that India has shelved its Chabahar investment and signed a new contract with the UAE's Fujairah line. In other words, Iran's bridge to Asia is being abandoned even by its own partners. This represents an unprecedented erosion of the Tehran regime's regional geopolitical standing. Even allies are pulling back, saying business with Iran is a risk. One of the Middle Eastern countries that recognize this risk is the United Arab Emirates. Its decision to leave OPEC is the clearest evidence of this. But what truly shook Tehran was not the decision itself. It was the geopolitically significant location at the heart of its impact. We are talking about the Habshan-Fujairah pipeline, controlled by the UAE. This 380-kilometer line carries oil directly to the Gulf of Oman without ever passing through the Strait of Hormuz. Since March 2026, exports through Fujairah have surged 57%. The line is currently pumping nearly 1.9 million barrels of oil per day. By exiting OPEC, the UAE will be able to put an additional 1 million barrels per day onto the market independent of any quotas. And Iran's entire Hormuz card strategy appears destined to collapse with a single move. The United Arab Emirates' strategic maneuver, leveraging its Fujairah pipeline and OPEC exit, fundamentally alters the regional energy landscape. This move not only bypasses Iran's primary choke point, but also introduces a new dynamic of supply independence, severely undermining Tehran's long-held geopolitical leverage over global oil transit. Because the UAE is now preparing to supply the oil the world wants from Fujairah, while Iran cannot find a single door beyond Hormuz, the UAE is opening a major artery that bypasses Hormuz entirely. The implications of this for Iran and the energy sphere are enormous. OPEC's share of global supply control has dropped from 30% to 26%. This figure is a disaster indicator for Iran because OPEC was keeping oil prices high through production quotas. A high price could have ensured that even Iranian oil sold on the black market, despite the blockade, still generated meaningful revenue. The UAE's exit could trigger a wave of supply that drags prices down sharply. Iran, meanwhile, is losing both its export volume and its per-barrel revenue at the same time. In other words, a two-front loss. In the wake of all this, it is only natural that the dark process triggered in Iran by the energy crisis and the decisions of regional actors is shaking the country to its core. And here what we encounter is the looming economic crisis the country is being dragged toward. Iran International's exclusive report dated April 27, 2026, spread through the world's press in a wave of shock. The Supreme National Security Council, chaired by Mohammad Bakr Zulfikar, had convened on an emergency basis. But this was no ordinary meeting. The assessment that leaked from the meeting read almost like a text of surrender. The council had reached three core conclusions. First, protests could break out again within days. Economic pressure is already a primary trigger. Second, the regime can withstand the blockade for at most 6 to 8 weeks. Third, by the end of spring, nearly 2 million jobs could be lost in the private sector. Security officials summed up the conclusion in a single sentence: unrest is inevitable. Only its timing is uncertain. In other words, the regime's own security apparatus is already acknowledging on paper that the country could lose its streets within a few weeks. This is not a leaked fear. It resembles more than anything a plan for surrender. For years, the Iranian regime had boasted with the rhetoric of being a fortress economy. The resistance economy, the strategy that defies sanctions, the shielded system, all those propaganda phrases are now meaningless. Now they are putting it in writing that this same fortress has only 6 to 8 weeks of life left in it. The social anger that was suppressed after January could ignite once again under economic pressure. The Council's warning makes that crystal clear. The question is no longer will it happen or not, but which day will it explode? And the regime with the document it itself drafted appears to have legitimized that very question. On another front, Tehran's acceptance of collapse is not limited to this alone. Even figures at the highest levels of the regime have come to grasp the U.S. blockade and its global ramifications. One of them is Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian. On April 25, 2026, he addressed the nation on state television. The speech was a humiliating appeal for the regime. Pezeshkian openly told the people, "Reduce your electricity consumption." Then came the striking advice. Instead of turning on 10 lamps in your home, turn on 2. What harm could there be? The president of Iran was telling his citizens to cut down on the number of lamps lit in their own homes. This may well be the last sentence the leader of a country that boasts of its military should ever have to utter. But Pezeshkian has no other card left to play. Government offices have begun operating on half-day schedules. It is reported that heating in the Tehran metro is being constantly cut. In major cities like Isfahan and Tabriz, streetlights have been reduced by half. The Iranian rial has plunged to 1.8 million against the dollar over the past 2 months. Annual inflation in the country has surpassed 40%. Lines for bread, meat, and milk are growing longer. Imported medicine prices have risen by nearly 60%. Pezeshkian's appeal reflects a reality the regime, despite all its propaganda machinery, can no longer hide from its people. The social contract the Iranian regime had bought with subsidies is unraveling, and a president is asking his own people, please don't become a trigger of discontent. So why is the regime allowing all of this to unfold inside Iran? In truth, the country's economic crisis did not begin with what is happening today. A significant portion of oil revenues was flowing directly to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. That money was going to Hezbollah, to the Houthis, to Iraqi militias, to the so-called resistance network in Syria. Now the artery is clogged. In Lebanon, Hezbollah has reached the point of being unable to pay salaries. In Yemen, the Houthis are using their last stockpile of drones. In Iraq, Shia militias are pulling back from the field because no funding has arrived. The Iranian regime is on the verge of losing within just a few weeks. The proxy war network it spent 40 years building. A soldier, a missile, a drone, a proxy group. All of it requires money. And money is no longer flowing into Tehran's treasury. The Revolutionary Guards had spent years declaring, if Iran perceives a threat, the response will be merciless. But the blockade silenced that threat with a single move that cut off the IRGC's cash flow. This silent financial collapse is also dismantling Iran's military deterrence piece by piece, because the Tehran regime had earned its regional weight by investing in the proxy war network. Now the channel of investment is about to dry up, and regional weight is evaporating at a pace not seen in decades. In other words, the regime had chosen the prominent figures of the IRGC and its proxy network over its own people. With today's emerging picture of economic crisis and the cutoff of energy exports, Tehran is entering a process from which return is nearly impossible. In fact, even US officials are warning that if the Tehran regime continues with this style of governance, far darker days lie ahead. One of the people issuing this warning is US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. On April 27, 2026, Bessent made a historic statement. Iran's oil pumping capacity will soon collapse, he said. And his final prophecy was a warning that found its echo on the streets almost immediately. A gasoline shortage may genuinely be looming in Iran in the very near future. A petroleum-producing country having its citizens line up for gasoline is a paradox rarely seen in geopolitical history. But just days after Bessent's statement, satellite images released through the U.S. Department of War further deepened the embarrassment. The images revealed that with its storage capacity exhausted, Iran is now using ships consigned to the scrapyard. In other words, decaying vessels incapable of putting to sea have been pressed into service as floating oil storage units. Iran possesses one of the largest oil reserves in the world, but it cannot find a single free route through which to move that oil. Hormuz is under blockade. Chabahar is choked. Fujairah is in the UAE's hands. What remains for the Tehran regime is nothing but the rusty boats sitting around its own ports, and inside them crude oil is being pumped like a locomotive. In other words, the exits are closing one by one. One of the most curious aspects of all this is that with such heavy clouds gathering over the country, the IRGC still refuses to open its enriched uranium sources to inspection. Perhaps the only way out for Tehran is approving unlimited, immediate, and intrusive access by the International Atomic Energy Agency to all sites in Iran. But under the IRGC's military pressure, Tehran's civilian government cannot even put this possibility on the table during negotiations. With the gradual disappearance of any agreement with the United States from the table, we are approaching the end of the 47-year myth of resistance. Since the 1979 revolution, the Iranian regime had mythologized its endurance against sanctions. Despite years of US sanctions, European embargoes, and UN resolutions, Tehran had remained standing. "We have never collapsed" was the cornerstone of the regime's propaganda. But the 2026 blockade is different because this is not merely a sanctions package. It is a physical blockade. Sanctions could be evaded through illicit channels. Tankers would conduct ship-to-ship transfers and switch flags. The AIS system would simply be shut off, but a blockade physically stops ships. A switched-off AIS is no obstacle to Marines fast roping in from helicopters. A flag changes no shield against satellite tracking. The U.S. Navy now tracks every tanker individually, identifies it, and boards it if necessary. You may recall that after the ship named Tuska, the tanker Tiffany was logged and stopped. The vessel Majestic X was also seized by the U.S. Navy. And most recently on April 28, 2026, the Comoros-flagged MV Blue Star 3 was halted in the Gulf of Oman. Marines from the U.S. 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit fast roped onto the ship from helicopters and conducted a thorough search. When no evidence was found in the vessel's voyage plan indicating a stop at an Iranian port, the ship was released, but the message was unmistakable. Around Hormuz and its surroundings, no ship can approach Iran without the U.S. Navy's permission. These operations proved that the blockade is not merely a maritime maneuver, but a tight legal and military encirclement. In every export attempt by sea, Iran is now confronted with the risk of losing its ships. Insurance companies have canceled all transport policies along the Hormuz line. The principal owners of the tankers have struck Iran routes off their lists. Even Asian buyers have pulled out of the Iranian oil supply side at once because the boarding of a tanker by the U.S. Navy is no longer a hypothetical. It has become an almost routine occurrence. Iran's "will sell oil through illicit channels" strategy is being tracked minute by overhead AWACS aircraft and Sentinel-2 satellites. Every CENTCOM announcement marks another notch in Iran's erasure from the global oil market. In other words, Tehran's energy card is falling apart piece by piece in the face of the physical blockade. What no sanctions package could ever achieve, the blockade is achieving in just a few weeks. The Council's assessment of "we can hold out for 6 to 8 weeks" is born precisely from this new reality. Resistance was once possible. Not anymore, because the naval blockade the United States is enforcing on Iran is a rare case in modern geopolitical history. The world has not witnessed a physical blockade of this scale in the last 50 years. The encirclement of Soviet ships during the Cuban Missile Crisis was short-lived. The Yugoslavia blockades were partly symbolic. The maritime pressures on North Korea were limited, but this striking 2026 Iran blockade is in an entirely different league. The sheer scope and persistence of this naval blockade represent a significant departure from historical precedents. Unlike past maritime pressures, which often had limited duration or symbolic intent, this operation demonstrates a sustained, comprehensive effort to physically interdict all Iranian maritime trade, signaling a new, more aggressive form of economic coercion. So, what awaits Iran in the days ahead? There are likely 3 possible scenarios for the regime. In the first scenario, the regime surrenders and brings its nuclear program to the table. In that case, Trump signs a comprehensive agreement in exchange for lifting the blockade. But this scenario would mean an enormous weakness in Tehran's domestic politics. The Revolutionary Guards could read this surrender as treason. In the second scenario, the regime resists and the blockade continues. In this possibility, the protests the Council warned of could erupt. Internal unrest could merge with economic collapse, and the regime could be forced to crack down harshly on its own citizens. We have already witnessed countless examples of similar harsh crackdowns during the heavy protest waves in January. In the third scenario, the United States could decide on a military strike. The short and forceful plan prepared by CENTCOM could be activated. Iran's nuclear infrastructure and Revolutionary Guards bases could be hit. If this scenario unfolds, Tehran would likely suffer a far more severe defeat.